Hello. Hello.
Over to you.
Are you
Yep.
there? Yeah, assuming you can hear me, I think the first question, or most obvious one, which people would like to know is, what made you decide on Caroline as a subject for your latest book?
It was complete chance, and the most wonderful chance. Just shows, there is a fate, a good fate, because I was interested in doing a book about a law case. I've always been rather fascinated by the law. I used to call myself a lawyer monkey until one of my grandchildren said, "Why are you a monkey, Grandma?" So I stopped, but I've always been interested in it. And I was thinking what sort of law case. And I had a very, very dim memory of some law case. And at the same time, one of my granddaughters, Honor Fitzgerald, who was reading for the bar, wanted gainful employment to support herself, quite rightly. And so I said, well, could you find me this trial? It's Caroline Norton. I can't remember the date, and I was terribly vague. But she, who now I'm glad to say a practicing barrister, found it. And the moment I read the trial, I was absolutely blown away. I thought, this is terrific. And of course, the more I read about it, the more fascinating it was. But it was all chance, if I'd not managed to read the trial and I didn't have real knowledge. So I've had such a good, fascinating time.
Well, tell us all what the trial was about and why it ever happened in the first place.
The trial was in 1836, and George Norton, your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, sued the Prime Minister, I agree, sued the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, for adultery with his wife, as though a Prime Minister would ever commit adultery. Extraordinary thought. Anyway, be that as it may, there was a tremendously, shall we say, raunchy case in which servants gave evidence. I've just mentioned sheets and things like that, and incidents, and it was all extremely, there was a terrific audience. Tickets were selling on the black market for huge sums of money to watch. But at the end of it, rightly or wrongly, you'll have to read my book, at the end of it, they were found innocent. In spite of that, in spite of Caroline being legally innocent, her husband was able to chuck her out of the house legally, keep her from seeing their 3 children, which was cruel, who were under 7, and enjoy the copyright of her writing. She was a writer. And the lack of married women's legal rights stunned me when I started to read about it, and has stunned everybody who's read my book, I find.
Do you think that there's anything in the suggestion that Caroline and Lord Melbourne's relationship might have been a real deep physical one, or do you think it was more in the nature of familiarity?
Well, familiarity was the word the judge used, familiarity, not intimacy. I kept a great file while I was working called DTDT, which stood for did they or didn't they? And I didn't make up my mind in advance. I try not to, because part of the fun of research is literally to research, to try and be led by the evidence. I finally came to the conclusion that it didn't go beyond what some people might call deep petting or foreplay, rather less amusing term. And the reason I give 2 bits of evidence. One is that there's a letter, she continued, she has the 3 children, or 2 of the 3 children during this period. There's a letter in which she teases, she was a great tease, she teases Lord Melbourne and says, who's a widower, and says he will marry the daughter that she's about to give birth to. Now, I do not believe anyone would do that if there was a possibility the child was his, just wasn't her style. That's
Is
why.
there another factor that George Norton actually drove Caroline round in his carriage to deliver Caroline to Lord Melbourne, and he would hardly have done that if he'd believed that he was driving them to a place of ill repute.
Well, I don't think you can describe 10 Downing Street as a place of ill repute, or if you do, you might get into trouble. No, she originally got in touch with Melbourne at the request of George Norton and asked him to help her husband get a job. That's a very important point. She didn't seduce Melbourne, and then she lived not far away from 10 Downing Street, Storey's Gate, which doesn't exist now. Handy for the House of Commons. And he used to come calling with another bit of evidence that the fact of the trial shows us that every time they rang for a servant, rang the bell, the servants would find them in what the servants said were compromising positions. But if you're really having sex, you do not ring the bell for a servant. So I don't think it went, as one might say, all the way. But readers are making up their mind, and I'm always interested to know what readers think. You know, someone came to see me the other day and said, "You're absolutely mad. Of course, they had it all together." You know, I've given all the evidence, and you know, the reader is sovereign.
Do you think that George, the husband, actually believed that Caroline had committed adultery with Melbourne, or is it more likely that he was pressurized by his older brother, who I'm sorry to say was Lord Grantley, who was an ultra-Tory, and also George Norton's godfather, Lord Winford, who was, I think, also an ultra-Tory and a judge and a man of some influence, pressurized by the pair of them into using George to cause embarrassment to the leader of the Whigs, Lord Melbourne, so that it might have been more for political purposes than anything else.
I think that's absolutely true. I think George Norton was put under pressure by his brother, the well-named Lord Grantley, and Lord Winford, as you say. I think he was a jealous, obsessional character, and I regret to say he indulged in domestic abuse, on giving Caroline a few biffs from time to time in a way that we find odious. But I have to say that once again, the laws were extraordinary. A man could beat his wife if the stick wasn't thicker than his thumb. I mean, that's horrifying because she was his property. But I don't think George Norton actually thought she was guilty of adultery, because I think he would have killed her if he thought that.
Yes, and the trial took place, I think, 9 years after they got married, during which time they'd had 3 children, and I think she spent quite a lot of the time being pregnant also. There were miscarriages as well. So it rather suggests not. There's another factor, isn't it?
One of the children was born. I think she was pregnant when she first had Melbourne come calling with the second child, and then the third one. And actually, the children were quite clearly his, you know, quite clearly full brothers. So I don't think that makes it any better on his part. Do you?
No, absolutely not. If we just step back for a moment, Caroline had her immediate older sister and younger sister were both like her, very attractive and popular in society. Now, they both seem to have married extremely well, you know, good men, the sort of men one would have hoped that Caroline would have married. And what's always puzzled me is why she settled for this awful dullard. I mean, she was only 19. Was it obligatory that if you didn't get married before you were 20, you were kind of on the shelf? And did her mother have a role in effectively accepting George Norton's proposal on her behalf? Because I feel surely she could have done so much better.
Yes, when looking back, one feels that. But you know, the great thing about history, we must always remember that what now lies in the past once lay in the future, in the words of F.W. Maitland. Caroline had a sort of romantic love for somebody who died, a young man called Leveson or Lewson Smith. He died, and her sisters get married. to be the unmarried sister. It's not happened to me, but I don't think sisters, I know a good deal about sisters, I don't think they like it. And I think it wasn't exactly obligatory, but it would be rather odd not to get married. George Norton, he wasn't a tremendous dullard. Don't forget, he was a successful magistrate. People liked him. He was an MP. I think we mustn't sort of underplay him. I quote Carlyle at one point on Heroes and Hero Worship. One of his subjects, he says, I mean to say all the good of him I possibly can. It's the way of getting at his secret. And I think if we make George Norton in advance before his evil behavior, if we make him too terrible, we make it a sort of mystery. But as it is, I think her social success, she was so amusing and so pretty and so delightful. And he then became, in contrast, dull. A dullard, oh God, here comes George Norton, bags not sit next to him dinner, that kind of thing. So I think it sort of grew.
Yes, well, but I mean, is it possible that she simply didn't meet enough other eligible young men and didn't really have a large enough a crowd to choose somebody from or develop a deeper friendship with?
Well, I don't think one should exaggerate his ineligibility, because he was the younger son of he was the youngest son. His brother would become Lord Grantley. But as you know, Lord Grantley didn't have children and never had children. So there was always the possibility. I mean, my father was the second son who succeeded to the Longford title. There was always a possibility that would happen. I don't think he was such a bad match, really. He turned out to be a very bad match.
Yes. Well, his CV read rather better than the reality, as it turned out.
Yes.
And Caroline was, in fact, extremely good to him in responding to his request that Caroline intercede with the Prime Minister to try and get him a job, because he thought that he was short of funds. How short he was, I don't know, but he definitely wanted to have an occupation and an income, and Caroline effectively got that for him.
But I think if your husband asked you to do something like that, I don't think that was exceptional. I think she was quite right to do it. I mean, I think she was a nice person. I think because of the way it turned out, we shouldn't exaggerate how odd it was. I think it was quite normal. She had Whig antecedents and he was Tory, and so it was sort of easy for her. And so she writes the fatal letter inviting round Lord Melbourne. And then I think it becomes a very odd story. But I don't think it's like the exciting thrillers. At first you think, I don't know where this is going. And then gradually the tension builds.
And then one of the people, I mean, their family home became a sort of political salon with lots of interesting characters of the day, not only in politics, but also in literature and culture more broadly. And one of the characters who, at a rather early stage in his career, who crossed the threshold and seemed to have been a friend, was Disraeli.
Yes, the young Disraeli. He was a friend. And what she did like was she liked bright young men with ideas and ideals, and later Sidney Herbert had a politician too little known because he died comparatively young, but he had wonderful plans and planned female emigration to Australia where people could have husbands and living. And she liked idealism. And I think being a salonière like that really suited her. And of course, she was very funny. Can I tell you one of her worst jokes?
Yes, of course.
Well, she was a dedicated opponent of slavery, I'm glad to say, and very interested in the fate of enslaved women, the high death rate among them, and thus a tremendous admirer of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And one of her worst jokes was to write a letter, I think it was possibly to Sidney Herbert, but she said, why was Uncle Tom's Cabin written by no human hand? Because it was written by Mrs. Beecher's toe. I love that kind of joke.
You mentioned Sidney Herbert, and I think we know that Caroline and Sidney Herbert were lovers, and this was well after Caroline's marriage had broken down. He was a little bit younger than her, and yes, the great lover of her later years was William Sterling Maxwell, who was, I think, 10 years younger. I mean, do we know about other lovers and whether they were also younger, and whether whether this implies anything necessarily?
I don't think it implies anything. I think that once her marriage had completely broken down, they weren't going to get a divorce, which would have removed any chance of seeing her children. I think her principal interest, frankly, was to see the children and the children. I think she was up for having a nice time. And I don't think she particularly wanted married men, thank you very much, after all of that. And therefore, a young man who possibly was looking for a charming, slightly older woman, a bit of, what was the word? Familiarity.
Yes.
I think suited her. I mean, I have to say, Richard, we can never know that someone and two people are lovers in history. You know, we can only guess. I think she and Sidney Herbert were lovers, and I think she and the very young William Sterling, as he then was, were lovers before he was married. And she remained, you see, she had a great gift for friendship. She remained a friend with William Sterling when he married Lady Anna. And then when Lady Anna finally tragically died suddenly in the very last months of Caroline's life, she married William Sterling, which I find very romantic.
And then Caroline, after the trial, even though George was shown to be lost credibility through losing the case, but it was actually Caroline who suffered through her reputation being tainted. And then she found herself, George went off with their young children, and she could do nothing about that. And she suffered a great deal and was determined to do something about it. And my goodness, she did.
This is where I admire her so much. Instead of just sitting down and wailing, you know, this terrible tragedy of the removal of her children and social disgrace, she started to campaign and lobby politicians, and she wrote pamphlets. And the first success was the Infant Custody Act of 1839. And it's absolutely extraordinary reading Hansard, the debates, which you can now read online. Wonderful. The revolutionary idea that a mother had the right to access to her own children, and that those lords were carrying on. They said it would be a recipe for adultery. Mothers could access to their children, even if they were not with the father. But in the end, it was passed in 1839. Queen Victoria, the young queen, signed the bill. And that was a great triumph. And Caroline should be included with that triumph.
Am I right in thinking that George tried to wriggle out of the obligation of giving access to his wife by taking them to Scotland, where the Act didn't apply, or perhaps not as much?
Absolutely, you're completely right. The Act didn't apply. It wasn't till, well, first of all, it was the tragic death of Willie, the little boy, which was entirely through neglect. He was riding a pony by himself, which he shouldn't have been. He fell off and had an injury which wasn't tended. He got septicemia. Oh, yes. There's Willie.
That's Willie, yeah.
And got septicemia and died, and asking for his mother. And poor Caroline was at Tunbridge Wells, I think, taking the waters. She got the message and she travelled north and north and north. And the person who met her at the station, Caroline said, "How is Willie?" And the person said, "He's dead." Awful.
Dreadful. Absolutely. And she'd hardly seen Willie at all since
No.
he was very young.
Quite.
Dreadful situation for a mother.
Yes.
Yes. And so the Infant Custody Act was the first and very important occasion on which, as a result of her campaigning, the law was changed.
Yes.
And then if we wind forward nearly nearly 20 years.
Let's be accurate. She contributed to the campaigning. You know, she wasn't an MP. Women didn't vote, or this is what she could do: lobby people and write pamphlets.
Her pamphlets seem to have been quite eloquent.
Yes, I found them very interesting reading them.
And what about her pamphlet to Queen Victoria? Her letter to Queen Victoria?
There was an assassination attempt at Queen Victoria, quite close to the current Albert Memorial, I think. Anyway, the Queen was pregnant too, and the whole nation was moved with horror. And Caroline, well, first of all, she wrote a poem about it all. And she also wrote a sort of pamphlet addressing Queen Victoria, not quite as one woman to another, but sort of, you know, referring to her as a mother. It's interesting, particularly as, you know, here we have a queen. We can completely understand somebody, a campaigner, feeling they could write to the Queen.
Just going down a slight tangent for a moment, an important part of Caroline's makeup was that she was a very successful novelist and poet, and she earned a very decent income, and of course was indignant when George pocketed the earnings for himself, as legally he was entitled to do. But how do you rate her novels and her poetry?
A good question. I like her last novel, Old Sir Douglas. If somebody asked me to recommend one, I would read that. I think there's another very good one, Lost and Saved. Those two are my favorites. Have you read any of them, Richard? I'm
ashamed to say I haven't.
No. Well, if you read one, I think Old Sir Douglas would be. And what is so marvelous about life nowadays, these things are printed in sort of pamphlets somewhere in California, and you know you can get it and read them, and also from the London Library.
I believe that some people at the time, in relation to her poetry, compared her with Lord Byron. I mean, not actually favourably, but the fact that they were compared at all is saying something.
Well, I think that's not quite accurate. She was called the Byron among poetesses. That's true, but they really meant her private life, I'm afraid.
But is it not the case that she proposed herself for the position of Poet Laureate, a position which actually went to Wordsworth?
I love that. She wrote the letter. I got the letter. It's somewhere. I can't remember. It's in some archive. Anyway, I got a photocopy of it because I wanted to see it. What cheek, what wonderful cheek, saying it'd be a very good thing with a queen on the throne and to have a woman poet laureate. Well, I have a footnote saying, actually, the first woman poet laureate was in the reign of a queen, which was, of course, as you know,
our present, yes.
Yes.
And she wrote the letter recommending herself to the Tory Prime Minister of the day, Robert Peel, who presumably was absolutely no sympathiser of Caroline because his great political opponent was Lord Melbourne.
Exactly. There's no record of any particular sympathy. I will speak with care because as you're descended from Lord Grantley, I'm descended from Sir Robert Peel.
Yes. And her style of writing seems to have been extremely romantic in accordance with the more romantic standards of the day, and it comes over as being pretty dated from what I can see. But I mean, she wasn't alone in having this romantic style.
I suppose dated. You see, I didn't pick up her novels. You can't pick up her novels; they're not there to pick up. I got them because I wanted to read them. Yes, I think they're of their time, but the plots are good. I mean, I wouldn't put anyone off. I mean, if you could, I'm not comparing her, but if you could read George Eliot, you could read Caroline Norton. You know, I'm not comparing them as writers.
Well, that's a thought. But if we move forward then to the second piece of legislation about which she felt very, very strongly, which was the Matrimonial Causes Act. Am I right in thinking that originally this resulted from a royal commission which recommended that the ability to get divorce should be taken away from the ecclesiastical courts and should be given to a new secular court, and that it should be made just a little bit easier than it had been previously.
Yes, it still was a double standard, actually. It was much easier for men. If a woman committed adultery, the man could sue, and that was that. But the woman, it was much more difficult. But that was the next one. And what her interest in it was not so much that divorce should be easier, but that women should be protected, that women's, their persons, their property, everything should be protected. She had this great feeling that she must work for the protection of women. And so she lobbied very hard.
And she managed to persuade a former Lord Chancellor to table some new clauses to the bill while it was going through the House of Lords, which for the first time gave divorced, or perhaps more importantly, separated women the right to own property, which had never existed before.
Exactly. And as you say, separated, because she was separated from George Norton. They never divorced. He didn't want to. And she didn't want to do anything to imperil her contact with the children. But separated is what people did. That a woman should still have some rights, not become a sort of no person. That's what she was very keen on.
It's bizarre if you think of it by modern standards, because if you were female and you weren't married, or you were widowed, you had a lot more rights than if you were just married.
And it's an even odder thing, thinking of infant custody. A woman who had a bastard with no visible, certainly no husband, no visible father, had complete control over her child, whereas a woman who was married, a sort of model, good, virtuous woman, had no control over her child before the bill. And that was extraordinarily illogical.
So did life for her become better after those two pieces of legislation and after they were separated, and then she was really looking after her two surviving children and making other friendships?
Yes, she was supervising the surviving children at school, and then sort of her care starts all over again when one of her children marries an Italian girl. Maybe we will see a picture of her, called Mariuccia, which causes Mariuccia is not descended from the highest ranks of the British aristocracy, as everybody keeps pointing out. She's obviously a very attractive Italian peasant girl.
I love the idea of having a little peasant blood. Why not?
There's a terrible photograph of her.
I don't remember seeing one of her young, because the one I know where you see her in old age, she doesn't really look very attractive.
No, but she was described as having freckles and things like that, which no wonder, poor Mariuccia, living in a hot climate with a lot of sun. But it sort of quite amuses me. And then Mariuccia has children, and of course Caroline's thrilled by that. And she becomes a very active grandmother.
And her oldest son, who died relatively young, having served in the diplomatic service, Fletcher, he rather unexpectedly converted to Catholicism, which was rather unusual in those days.
It was quite unusual, but don't forget, it's the beginning of the sort of Oxford movement, which will end up with Cardinal Newman. And there's just been a biography of a Spencer, that, part of the Spencer Althorp family, became a Passionist monk, Father Ignatius Spencer. And in my own family, Charles Reginald Pakenham, younger son of the Earl of Longford, brother-in-law, the Duke of Wellington, became a Passionist monk from being sort of Tory, Church of Ireland, So it was beginning to happen. And that's what I found interesting. And when he sadly died, he had the last sacraments, as you know, Catholics do. And then, of course, once again, the problem of the Catholic funeral, which he wanted. And he's buried, I think, isn't
And
he?
then Caroline's last surviving son, Brinsley, the one who married the Italian peasant girl, it seems as though Brinsley wasn't very capable, and Caroline effectively was responsible for bringing up Brinsley's two children, that is to say, Caroline's two grandchildren.
Yes, I think, and she had, at last what she'd always wanted, to bring up children, and I think it was heaven for her. She loved it. And one of them, Carlotta, was never married, was extremely, I think, eccentric and wonderful. And then your great-great-great-grandfather was also interesting and clever. I think she had a very good time, which she had deserved.
Well, I was lucky enough to be able to attend the unveiling of the English Heritage Blue Plaque, which you unveiled and made a speech at, and that can be found online through a link to The Guardian. And something that puzzled me is, why on earth did it take so long for Caroline to get this blue plaque?
Well, the whole of blue plaques is a sort of mystery. I was just so thrilled and honoured. It was naturally nothing to do with me at all. Out of the blue, I got an invitation to unveil it. I couldn't believe it. That was another piece of fantastic luck. But English Heritage decided this year to have 6 plaques to women, and headed with Princess Diana, her flat as a young girl, sort of in Chelsea, including the great designer whose clothes I'm still wearing, copied, Jean Muir, and Caroline Norton. And it was fun, wasn't it?
It was great fun. We had very good weather. And of course, a phenomenon of these occasions nowadays, which wouldn't have been the case 20 years ago, is that everybody has their smartphones and is trying to take photographs. And I'm afraid that when both you and the plaque were in the same foreground, it was very difficult, jostling, to find a place where one could take a photograph without someone else's elbow appearing in front of you.
Well, all I know is the first plaque I've unveiled, and I was very carefully instructed, very nicely, exactly which, there were 3 ropes, exactly which one to pull, at which point I carefully, with enormous care, pulled the wrong one. But luckily, nothing happened. So I went on pulling until I got the right one.
Do you think that at some stage in the future, you might be looking down from on high when somebody unveils the plaque to you?
Well, I may not have got on high by then. I may be down below. But it has to be 20 years after someone's death, i.e. Harold Pinter, my late husband, who people often say, why isn't there a plaque on the house in which I'm sitting? He's only been dead for 12 years.
Right.
Perhaps one day he'll have a plaque.
Yes. Gosh. And I mean, just finishing off on Caroline, and I feel that I would love to have met her, because she seemed such a very engaging and amusing and intelligent person, and I think I would. So I love the idea of her being a bit flirtatious as well. But I mean, perhaps women might have regarded her slightly differently. Would you like to have known her?
Well, perhaps, no, I would love to have known her. I feel, let's say that her circumstances are completely different. And she went to Oxford, which wasn't possible in those days. The first university, well, Cambridge was later. But she's a person I might have been at Oxford with. I would have liked her very much, because she was fun, and also she was interested in, events. No, I'd love to have known her. And I think she would have loved you, Richard.
Well, that's very nice of you to say so. And I think the two of you would have got on extremely well. Perhaps at this stage, I should ask Sarah if anybody has sent in any questions they'd like to put to the author. Oh dear, there's a question to me. This is very alarming. What does it say, Sarah?
Right. So, for Lord Grantley, please, what do you admire most about Caroline, and were you aware of her achievements growing up and as a family?
Well, to answer the second question, I read I think it was the second biography of Caroline that had been written about her by Alice Ackland, which is relatively short and easy to read. I read that when I think I was 11 or 12 and was much struck by it, but didn't learn more about her until much later when some further biographies were written. And about 10 years ago, there was a very good biography by Diane Atkinson, I think, to whom we must pay tribute, and who I think also lobbied English heritage in the matter of getting a blue plaque set up. To the former question, what would I have liked about her? What do I admire about her? I admire most particularly her determination not to do something about. I think that Antonia has mentioned this herself earlier. She wasn't just going to sit back and mope. She wanted to get something done, and the fact that she knew all these politicians, and she was very well known in public life, meant that she had the ability to use these connections to lobby, to write, and the determination to keep going. Because when you start a campaign of that nature, you never know whether you're going to succeed or not. You hope you will, but sometimes it's more hope than expectation. But she jolly well put in the hours and the effort, and it must have taken an emotional toll, but it must have been very satisfying for her to have achieved some success.
Thank you. There's a question for Lady Antonia from Kathleen, which was, how do you even begin to research a book like The Case of the Married Woman?
Well, in this case, as I said, it began with the trial. But the first thing I have to know the facts. I'm not a historical novelist. And until I know the facts, until I know the main facts about someone's life, I don't feel secure. And so I get myself out, I make a sort of time scale. I do a lot of writing by hand. I mean, I write on a computer, but a lot of notes on hand. I make on loose leaf notebooks. So I've got a scale of what happened, and then what happened, then what happened. I also have card indexes of characters, of which I gather bits. And gradually, the picture from being sort of spectral becomes with more colour. And there comes a moment when you feel, yes, I really must write it down. I want to write it down. And that's the moment at which you do. And that's a very exciting moment. It's completely different because by then I've got a structure, which I'm very keen on, as I said, a structure and masses of notes. But then you must go for it because you must keep the narrative. You owe it to the reader. And I was incredibly lucky because I'd done all my research and then lockdown came. And just as I was thinking, I want time to write this book, time jolly well came. And I can never grumble. I mean, of course, like everyone, I did grumble, but I can't really grumble about lockdown because it gave me the opportunity to write this book.
Can I ask a couple more myself? One is to ask you, Antonia, whether I noticed that just in the last couple of years, the collected letters of Caroline have been published in 3 volumes by Ross Belson. And so I went on to a well-known website with the hope of buying these 3 volumes and discovered that I would have to pay £750 to buy them. And so I decided perhaps to postpone the purchase. Did what you found in those diaries add to what was already previous knowledge? Were they very significant in your researches or not?
I was halfway through my researches when they were published. Ross Belson and Murray McMulvey Roberts, who did it together, have become good friends, were incredibly helpful to me. And having them halfway through, I mean, of course, it would have been lovely if it had been at the beginning, but there are other sort of, not quite like that, there's been nothing on that scale, but there are other printed edition of her letters. And as I say, both of them were extremely helpful. I didn't pay £700. And I tell you what, Richard, one day when I've finished with Caroline Norton, I'll give you my copies. Is that a deal? Is that a deal?
Yes, I suppose I'll probably have to inform HMRC for inheritance tax purposes. And perhaps a final question, but one which I think will be of interest to everybody. I remember discovering that you were writing about Caroline by looking you up on the internet, and I found that you'd given an article to given an interview to a most unexpected publication, or at least it was unexpected to me, which was Christian Scientist Monitor. And you told Christian Scientist Monitor that you were writing something about Caroline. And I said, hip, hip, hooray, how wonderful, and how unexpected to find out this way. I know it's always a silly question if anyone asks you, are you writing anything now? Because you always say yes, but when do you think we and the outside world might discover what your latest book is about, and whether we should examine that most interesting journal, the Christian Scientist Monitor, to get first sight?
No, I believe in absolute equality, so it won't go. This coup will not go to the Christian Science Monitor. It will go somewhere of similar stature. I never talk about work in progress. As you know, it's irritating to people, but there's a good reason for it, because I'm concentrated on Caroline now, talking about her, and I owe it to her to do my best. If I start thinking about something else, but I shall write another book. I have got another subject, just to tease you.
No, we can all look forward to happy in the thought that Caroline is not your last work.
Well, I've worked out as follows, if I may say so, that I'm always going to write, and only two things will stop me. One is death, and the other is dementia. And as I shan't notice dementia, I shall just keep on writing. That leaves death.
Well, I would like to say, Antonia, thank you very much indeed for coming on this interview, and indeed for allowing me to try out for the first time my abilities as an interviewer. I don't expect to be re-employed in this capacity, but you are certainly a pro as an interviewee, and we're all incredibly grateful to you for coming and doing this. And just in case anyone hasn't got the message, Antonia's book on Caroline is extremely good, and it's short, relatively short, that is. It's concise, and it's a cracking good read. And if anyone's in any doubt, buy the book.
Lady Antonia and Lord Grantley, thank you so much for such a fascinating and informative evening. And not only that, thank you so much for championing the name Caroline Norton, and Lady Antonia for adding your considerable literary influence to the cause of ensuring she becomes a household name once more, but this time for all the right reasons. Thank you.
Oh, terrific, Richard.
I suppose we're now alone and we can engage in off-camera indiscretions.
We still have 40 people with us, so I wouldn't at the moment if I were you.
Okay. Right, well in that case it's goodbye and I'm signing out.
Hi. Thank you ever so much.
It wouldn't have happened without you.